Hey, it's Tristan. Just want to let you guys know two things before we start this episode. Firstly, I'll be today's host. We're looking to have me in the host seat more often, so if you enjoyed today's episode, look forward to that. Secondly, we experienced some slight technical issues when filming this episode that left our video quality a little lower than usual, but despite that, I think we have an interesting conversation for you all. With that out of the way, I give you Jake Clapham, creator of Flashback History and Darkest Chapters.
What exactly happened down there?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I talked to him and blah, blah, blah. He asked about you guys and da 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 da. More questions, blah, blah, blah.
I have been following your content for a while now, and I'm a big fan. And I've found you probably a couple months ago, but I have been binge watching everything you've done. I haven't quite got through your catalog, but it's all very interesting. And so, speaking of that content, how did you get into history?
Quite by accident. So I studied politics, philosophy, and economics at university, and with the intention of becoming a lecturer of that subject. Um, to become a lecturer is to do a master's and a PhD, so it's about 4 years, and there's no guarantee afterwards that you'll actually get a job, even as a lecturer, let alone as a full-time academic. Um, the thing I loved most about it was the teaching, so I went to go and study to be a teacher. Originally, I wanted to teach English literature, but they wouldn't accept me because I hadn't studied at university. And the closest subject that interested me that I was allowed to teach was history. So I was a high school history teacher. We call it secondary school in the UK for about 4 years. And then I switched to video about 3 years ago. And then about a year ago, I was like, okay, I love history and I love making videos. So let's put them together and make a YouTube channel.
So you had a lot of experience actually teaching history then, or at least some experience. Do you miss the classroom setup, or are you kind of more happy with the not having to actually be there in front of everyone kind of situation?
So I definitely miss being able to interact directly with students. And I miss the classroom itself. Um, I don't miss the business of being a teacher. Teachers in the UK work incredibly hard under very trying circumstances for relatively poor pay. And I realized quite quickly that I was not hardworking enough and self-disciplined enough for that lifestyle to suit me, and left. So I don't miss being a teacher, but I definitely miss the classroom sometimes. It's a very different experience talking directly to a camera, or even like to a host like yourself, even though this is a live conversation. It's not a pre-recorded lecture, so to speak. Um, it's not quite the same as actually having a group of kids or even students in general. Sometimes I do live talks in London and they're great just to have a bunch of people in a room and share something. Yeah, I do miss it.
I can imagine. I had a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of teachers through my high school, time in high school, and history teachers were oftentimes the most engaged in their subject I found. I suppose that comes with the sort of territory. It's a lot harder to be excited about math in the same way as history. Math, is very direct, very there is this answer, there is this here. Whereas history, there is that nebulousness that kind of invites that curiosity.
I'd agree. I would also say, though, um, most people who go to study mathematics at university don't have the intention of being a teacher. And most teachers at university also haven't studied straight mathematics at university. Most of them have an adjacent numbers based subject, say economics or kind of science. Um, Whereas I think history teachers, a lot of them have had an education in history or a similar humanities subject, and are just looking for a way to make a living in that field. And so they bring a lot of passion and excitement to the classroom with them because it's the subject that they love.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you didn't actually intend to get into history. You intended to get into English literature, which I know is at
Yes.
least somewhat connected to history. You're going to be reading Shakespeare, you're going to be reading works from historical periods. What did you have a love of history going into literature, or was it solely the literature? And then you got into history because of this.
Ah, so my love was for philosophy, really. That's why I did my dissertation at university. That was what I thought about most of the time during my early intellectual life. Um, I chose English literature for that reason. So it would be very difficult to get a job as a philosophy teacher in the UK. The closest thing you'd get is a religious education teacher. But I'm not particularly religious. I grew up in an observant Buddhist household and was always interested in Christianity, but was never personally that religious. And especially during university, around that time in my life, I would say I was, if anything, anti-religious. That's mellowed a lot somewhat recently. Um, so English literature was just the closest thing that I could have done that was philosophy adjacent. All of the classic, I mean, take Shakespeare for an example, just since um, you opened and asked about it. So in Shakespeare, you'll find all kinds of moral dilemmas that philosophers argue all the time about. The story of Julius Caesar, for instance. I know that's a bit more historical, but still, there's all these moral questions about, is it acceptable to kill a dictator, even if he's your father-in-law? Or should the obligation to your family come first? Is there such a thing as a just ruler? Yada, yada, yada. So all of these big questions about life, the things that we grapple with all the time, they appear in so much of foundational English literature anyway. So that was why I chose literature.
I personally I'm a big reader. I don't tend to read a lot of I've read some of the classics. I've read, Dracula, Shakespeare, um, Flowers for Algernon. I don't know if that counts as classic. I've read some, especially back in my school days. But I do find that even when you get into the really I want to talk about wizards and superheroes and all this, it tends to be far more interesting when you do have that philosophical basis. I think the greatest works, even in the modern day, tend to need that rooting down there.
Yes. Well, I think this is personal. I think it does change from reader to reader, but the things that excite me most in literature or stories are moral quagmires. This idea of whether or not the protagonist is doing the right thing in the moment. So I don't particularly, for instance, enjoy fantasy that much, since you mentioned wizards, right? Harry
Yeah,
Potter
absolutely.
or Lord of the Rings. It's pretty clear cut who the goodies and baddies are. And it's about making sure that everyone kind of has the appropriate response and gets together and overcomes the evil. Whereas, since we're using films and that, if you looked at, say, something like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, it's the moral tension that makes those shows so interesting, at least to me, right?
Yes, sir.
Walter White is left with this dilemma about whether or not he's going to leave his family destitute or do something awful. And every single time he has to do something awful, he chips away a piece of himself until he's no longer recognizable. And you can have conversations all day about whether or not it was right or wrong to do this thing or that thing throughout the whole show. I think that ethical tension is what drives so much of literature and movies and also in history as well. It's the thing that I find so interesting. Obviously, you have to be careful with history because you do to an extent need to judge people by the standards of their time. But moralizing about what actions were acceptable, what weren't, what might have been going through someone's mind, what principles needed to be potentially sacrificed. I think those are all really interesting parts of history. I hope that's what people enjoy about Flashback whenever we do some kind of atrocity or something, is I'm trying to get people to think about why people were doing these things and not necessarily feeling evil as they did them.
I think there is something to be said about judging people by the standards of their time, because I I I grew up in Kentucky, and the very standard belief system in Kentucky is very conservative, all things considered. I consider myself very liberal, but the general attitude towards anything regarding, for example, transgenderism or homosexuality is rather negative. And a lot of people I know are like, "Oh, I can't believe how you would associate with people like that." And while I strongly condemn the beliefs, I don't think they understand how all-consuming that sort of brainwashing is. The idea that if you live in this setup your entire life, it's almost impossible to peel back that that development you've had to see things in another light.
Yeah,
I'm sorry I'm
agreed.
adjusting my camera so much. I'm
Yeah,
trying to
me
get
too. I think the opposite side of debate would probably say the same things about brainwashed lefties on the coast, right?
Oh,
They
absolutely.
would assume that their beliefs are not truly legitimate, that no one actually thinks that way who is reasonable and thinking, and that they must all be brainwashed by the woke media, yada yada yada. When in reality, sure, most people are intellectually a product of their environment, but those those feelings and opinions are deep and real. They're not just by
That's true.
default. At least they're not felt as to be by default.
That is true. I do think there is that genuineness there. I still do think that it does become very hard to look past what you are told. You look what you're told your entire life. I know a lot of people who are very religious here, and the way they'll view the world is very much, yeah, Jesus is real. I can buy white bread at the store. And to me, that's very, not even on an anti-religious level, that's very odd to me. The lack of desire to say, oh, wow, this person came back from the dead and altered the course of human history. They just kind of accept that as that's just how it is. There is no reason to look deeper.
Well, that's the story, isn't it? Right?
That's true, yeah, but it's always odd to me. But
Again,
no, sorry,
again, as someone who was raised in a fairly religious household, my father is Buddhist, but he's also very open to other religions, particularly Christianity, because he's also English, and we have a Church of England and so on. It is amazing how, if you were to present these ideas to someone outside of the context of their environment, right? If you were to just come along to someone, as you say, such and such person was born 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world and died for our sins, and he's going to come back one day. You'd be utterly confused about why anyone would believe this. It does seem like such a strange set of beliefs. But once it's part of your intellectual diet, once it's part of your environment, even the most absurd things can seem really normal. I personally don't necessarily believe it, but I'm sure that there'll be things in 500-600 years that people will laugh at people like me for believing, and I have no idea what they are.
absolutely. That's a very good point. And also, I mean, taking aside all of the religion, all of the philosophy, everything, the real world is rather absurd. We exist on a ball hurtling through space. A giant ball of fire is what gives life to everything. And hardly ever do we think twice about that. But yeah, we exist in absurdity and we develop to accept it. So I guess at some point, the human brain has to be able to accept whatever just to kind
Well,
of.
I think that's the interesting thing about humans in general, especially throughout history, is facts become accepted so easily, even when they sound utterly absurd. I reckon, you know, uh, the belief that we're on a ball floating through space around a big fireball, I don't take any disagreement with it. It's probably the reality of affairs. But I would be really interested to think about what we hold to be true now, that just turns out to be absolute balderdash in 100 or 200 years. That interests me more than, say, the inherent absurdity of things. I do
That's a
think
fair
things
point.
are naturally absurd, of course. But I think if you spend too long thinking about it, you don't really tend to get anything out of the thought.
No.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes, sir. I was just kind of emphasizing how the human brain can accept a lot of things. But on
Oh,
what you're
yes, it
saying,
can. Yeah, for
didn't
sure.
this might be exaggeration, but didn't we used to believe that if the human body went faster than like 45 miles an hour, that you would have like some horrible, not combustion, but something would go horribly wrong with the body? And then we invented a train, and that kind of just, I might be wrong about that. That's something I've heard. One of those things, I've heard my entire life and never questioned, just because. But yeah, it's there. I've seen so many people so confident in their absolute beliefs. And who knows, we could find something tomorrow that recontextualizes the entirety of human history or the entirety of science. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible.
No, but I think the important thing is that intellectually we have to be open to it, right? That
It's
if you're
true.
like, theories and systems of thoughts, they're how we interpret the world, and most importantly, they're how we predict it. Um, but they're only useful so long as you're capable at all times of reviewing your evidence and making sure that your claims follow from your premises. Who knows what that will be, though? I don't know about the train story, but I do know that there was an accepted like maximum limit for how fast a human could sprint. and that any further would induce a heart attack or was not physically possible. But there was a big deal made of a runner, I think he was in the late 60s, who managed to do 100 meters in some unbelievably short time. And everyone was like, wow, humans can do absolutely anything now. All the rules have been broken.
It's yeah, like that regard, yes, something just absolute new evidence came out that shattered what we believed to be possible. And who knows in even 20 years what that will be, but much less 1,000, 10,000 years.
I think AI might be the one that comes up soon.
Really?
I think AI is going to settle a lot of questions, or perhaps open a few more that we're not ready for, about what it means to be conscious, about whether something can have a will without necessarily inhabiting a biological body. So much of our premises about what we want, what we like, what we aim for, come through the lens of evolutionary psychology, right?
Yes.
What happens when you have something that's not biological, and yet seems, at least on the surface, to have the propensity for consciousness, for a will, for some intent? Are they owed the same rights, privileges, liberties as a person, or are they something else? Like, again, we might not get answers in 20 years, but we're going to have a few more questions
It's going
for
to get
sure.
weirder for sure. I think with AI, though, that's going to come down to the fact is it really sentient, or is it perfectly copying sentience? But if it is that case, are we actually sentient, or are we just so good at pretending to be this quote unquote sentient that we trick ourselves? And is that all that really is? Because there's the
When you
whole. Go ahead.
when you were asking the first half of the question, are AI sentient, or are they just really good at pretending to be? I was about to ask, can you prove that you're not just
Absolutely.
pretending to be either? I couldn't.
The only way we could maybe do something like that would be, and this would be a talking about scientific discoveries, this would be absolutely game changing. The discovery of something like a soul or an equivalent, some ID tag on sentient life throughout the universe. I don't know if such a thing exists even.
If such a thing could even be proven, if it did exist. But
Even if we did find it. Oh,
that
there
would
was
be
that.
that would certainly change things.
Wasn't there the one guy who he was measuring people as they died, was measuring their weight, and he found just like I'm trying to think of a measurement, an incredibly small amount of weight differentiating when the person passed away that he believed was
Yes.
the soul leaving the body.
Yeah. So this, I forget the name of the guy who did the study, but I do know that it's incredibly controversial. The methods that were used during the study and the publications afterwards, and what it might say about if there's some part of us that leaves once we're dead that's not attached to our material being. Um, I wouldn't take this study as conclusive evidence
No.
of the existence of a soul.
Well, as we die, don't I'm not a biologist, but I know that a lot of things end up leaving the body in those moments, whether it be, urination and stuff like that. But there's so many factors that could have gone into play that would have made the body, at least in that specific point where it's being weighed, lighter than it would have been otherwise.
Sure.
Because it was a
Probably
tiny.
so. I'm not a biologist either.
I'm not. Yeah, no, we're kind of just throwing out stuff. But as I got into the concept of studying death in history, Flashback History and your sister channel tend to cover very dark subjects in history. Like you don't really cover like, oh, this is what the peasants how they fed themselves, and this is the diet, and this is the celebration. You cover the darkest moments in history more often than not.
Yes, I do. Um, that that is a strategic choice to build an audience. And when I started YouTube, I put all sorts of stuff out there. Funny moments, ridiculous battles. Day in the life of a medieval peasant was one that I really liked, and I have since tried to experiment with stuff that is not as dark and as sensational. But I've found that it just doesn't seem to resonate with the audience as much. People, it seems, like to hear me narrate and tell these horrible stories. And, you know, I, I'm not fussy. If that's what people want to hear, if those are my hits, I'll play them all night long.
Now,
I think the reason, not this is not me trying to blow my own trump it. But I do think that the reason that these atrocities and these dark subject matters have done quite well for my style of presentation is I'm not a naturally funny person. And I always come across as very awkward when I try and crack jokes on camera. But I do have a very deep sense of empathy, not just for the victims, but also for the ones who were doing the crimes. Now, by empathy, I don't mean that I feel sorry for them as well, although in some cases I do, because not all people who do war crimes are willing participants in that in that act. Some people are forced to do so. But it's mainly about understanding where it comes from, being empathetic to their worldview. Why on earth would you think that this attempt at genocide, or that these series of violations of human rights, or whatever it might be, why would you think that in the moment that's an appropriate act? And there are very few cases. There are some, but there are very few cases where it just comes from pure human sadism. There's usually an intellectual and a moral framework around what they're doing that justifies it. And I think so often when we watch, especially documentaries or YouTube videos, we lose a lot of the why they're doing this and focus a lot more on what they're doing and who they're doing it to. But unless we figure out where these impulses come from, they're bound to reappear, you know?
And even with the human sadism element, more often than not, that doesn't come from nowhere. Most people are not born innately loving violence. That is a response to some trauma or something in some situation or some, cultural element. So I feel like
Well,
you can't even strip that away from the historical context.
no, definitely not. There is a small category of humans, um, called who are known as psychopaths, who are not do not learn to become bad. Let's say they're born so. As far as I'm aware, a sociopath is someone who develops antisocial tendencies as a response to their experiences in early life. A psychopath is born this way, but even psychopaths are not necessarily by default sadists.
No, they're
It's just that they don't have the
un-
same emotional parts of the
unempathetic.
brain light up. But yeah, no, you know, sadism does appear. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come out of a vacuum. I don't think. Although there are some cases, if you look at Japan's conduct in China, for instance,
The most horrible moments in
where
history.
sorry,
One of the most horrible moments in history. I've studied history to a point, and it truly is deeply disturbing. And
yeah,
real quick, if I could interject, you mentioned that you find fantasy as oftentimes very black and white, very one-sided. I was going to challenge that at some point just throughout this episode, because I know some fantasy works are not like that. One of them is a book series called The Poppy Wars that is heavily inspired by those events. Now you
right.
were talking about a very not black and white, very morally gray story with characters who are forced to do horrible things, and you're wondering if that's acceptable or not. That is a
Mhm.
story I would highly recommend.
Yeah, fair. I wasn't trying to poo-poo
No,
fantasy.
no, no, I understand
Um,
entirely. I just, it wasn't me being offended. It was more so, ooh, I have all of these recommendations now that, might, like, I didn't mean to interrupt so much. I'm sorry.
no, no, not at all. What would you mind repeating? Was it the Poppy Wars?
The Poppy Wars by R.F.
Yeah,
Kuang.
when I can, I'll take a
Very
look.
controversial
Um,
book series, too.
I can imagine. Yeah. I'll take a look. I'll take a look. Well, oh yes, Japan and China. So I was in Japan about a month ago shooting a documentary there on the Second World War from the Japanese perspective, and I've got a writer who works with me, and he lives he lives sort of part time in China and part time in the UK, and we were arguing in a bar after filming a segment on the Nanjing massacre, sometimes known as the Rape of Nanking, and we were arguing about where it came from, right? What? Because like if you look at the Nazis in Europe and their persecution of Jews and Poles and all kinds of undesirables, there's a real clear intellectual connection between the writings in Mein Kampf, the basis of fascism in Germany, and then the eventual outbreak of violence and death in Eastern Europe. Like, it's really easy to connect the dots about where that came from.
A lot of
It's
them,
not
yeah.
easy to understand why people participated in it, but the kind of connect the dots, the skeleton of the moral outrage is roughly visible. Whereas in China, it just seemed to just come out of nowhere. It was so extreme, so prolonged, so absurd in that there wasn't some desire to exterminate another race. There was no ideological basis for it. It just seemed to come out of nowhere. And we were having quite a heated conversation on where it came from. He thinks that it came from the sense that from the Japanese perspective at the time, the Chinese weren't human, and so they weren't afforded the same moral consideration that they were. But even if I don't think personally, I don't think that's the case. I think it came from somewhere else, because you wouldn't do that necessarily to a city full of animals. No one's breaking into zoos and doing that kind of stuff just because they're not human. There must be something. There must be somewhere else that it's come from. And to be honest, that I don't have an answer. I've kind of left it as a big question mark in the documentary itself.
If
It's
I
up to
had
it's up to the watchers to decide.
if I had to throw out a his theory, and I think you have to be very careful with theories in history because it's very easy to, with your theory, say, oh no, this is what they were thinking. When you weren't there, none of us were there, none of us experienced what they were experiencing. But I know that there was a lot of experimentation going on. I believe it was Shiro, that was the man who was leading research. Am I correct there, or am I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Shiriishi, or Ishishiro in Japanese.
Okay. Yes, sir. Um, I think he probably was just, as you mentioned, a very evil person. The people working under him probably had to just be continue to dull their own senses towards humanity, to continue working under him. It wasn't necessarily at least in my belief, something that they came in with. It's something that they had to do these horrible things. And slowly, the more they did them, the more desensitized they became.
Yes, that's certainly true.
At least a theory of
Seventh
mine. Go ahead.
Unit 731 is hard because, unlike, say, Nazi concentration camps, which have loads of evidence, because there are, for instance, survivors, and Nazis were later asked to testify in court. So we've got loads of evidence around what was happening, why it was happening, why people made the decisions that they made. Whereas Unit 731 was never really publicly acknowledged. There was no trial for the perpetrators after. They were basically given legal immunity in exchange for sharing their research, and there were no survivors. So we can't really be sure what went on. One guy did break the silence in the 70s or 80s and basically said what you said. He didn't know what he was signing up for. He found himself there. He realized that if he didn't play by the rules of the game, he probably wasn't going to leave alive, because they wanted good old boys, that were going to keep their mouth shut and get on with it. And so he just kind of cracked on, got to work, and as slowly found it more and more normalized, acceptable, less disgusting. But after the war was over, after he was removed from that environment, it clearly played in his conscience for a long time, because he eventually felt the need to break the silence and incriminate himself.
I, I think you can find a similar situation in a modern day, very big case currently with the Epstein files. Because I've seen people talk about now we have no idea how much in the files are real. I think some very terrible things happened. I don't want to necessarily say what I believe happened, what not I believe happened, but even the shallowest dip your toes in there. How did people get to that point? And a lot of people I've talked to have kind of come with the idea that when you become a big celebrity, you're invited to this party and you're like, oh, this is great. I can make connections. And then there's some girls there who look a little young and they're like, don't worry, they're 18. Don't worry. So you slowly, that's where it starts. And then just inch by inch, just one step down to hell after another. You don't even realize what you've done. Not to condone these actions or say that these people should be treated lightly for them, but it's almost a cautionary tale of how easy it is to become those people under the right circumstance.
Possibly. I really don't know much about the Epstein case. I find these kinds of modern scandals a little bit boring. Which is not to mean that I don't find it horrifying. I do. But so much of it is speculative right now that you're just kind
That's
of waiting
true, yeah.
to get the answers, and the gossip in between is I'd rather wait till the fog's cleared, so to speak.
That
But
makes sense.
I do think that what you're saying is possibly true, at least for some people. Like, no one wakes up in the morning and decides, I'm going to do some really fucking horrible shit today, and I'm gonna go down in history as one of the worst sex offenders, yada yada yada, or have been associated with him. I think most people, as you say, a red flag comes up and they don't challenge it, and then it's normalized, and then the next thing comes up and they don't challenge it, and then it's normalized. And I think a lot of people actually will find the statements we've just made quite outrageous, because we're almost saying that these people weren't aware of what they were doing, um, or that they didn't mean it, or that they're in some way excused, and they're not. It's just as horrible, but I think we need to have an open and honest conversation about where these kind of crimes and these kind of horrible acts come from. And if we're not prepared to have that conversation, we've got no chance of stopping it in the future.
It's so much more convenient to pretend that people like Shiro or Epstein or all of these people are sort of all their own, that they were born evil, that they are these movie villains who came into the world full of this evilness. Because it's terrifying to confront, I feel, for a lot of people, that bits and pieces of that exist in everyone. That there is the worst parts of humanity in all of humanity. There's also the best parts of humanity and all of humanity.
I would gripe slightly with the choice of words. I would say anyone rather than everyone. Do you know
Fair
what I
enough.
mean?
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't think that everyone has the capacity to
There, yeah,
get
that's
along
fair.
on Epstein's island, but you couldn't rule it out in
Yeah,
anyone.
yeah.
It does seem to, some people do seem to really take to the opportunity to do harm to others. You just have to give them the chance.
But the capacity,
Issue
yeah,
is a good example of it. He was given the chance to run his own project, and I think he decided more or less from the outset that he was going to abuse that opportunity.
that's true. Though I suppose, we can't. The capacity for evil itself is not punishable. You have to, it sounds weird, but we can't just say, oh, you are capable of being a bad person, that you are a bad person. Which is scary, though, because that means we have to let these people exist in the world with us. But
Well,
is it?
capacity again is this is the philosopher in me coming out.
I enjoy this. I like philosophy
Um,
as well.
capacity, I think all of us have the capacity to do awful things, um, as in like physically
Yeah,
or, and psychologically sometimes. I think the capacity to do evil is not a problem at all, as you say, but the appetite is, uh, and that where that comes from is a lot darker. But for instance, if we take Epstein, since we're on him, right? He had the capacity to do these evil things: the money, the connections, the private island, the protection that he got from being involved with really powerful people. That in itself, I don't think anyone would find absolutely morally outrageous. Some people would, because of the wealth inequality argument, the idea that the world should function no matter who you are. I agree with all that. But the thing that I think really outrages people is the appetite that he had to use all of these capacities, all of these uh, strengths, systems, advantages to then do the most horrible things that you could possibly imagine. It's almost like he was trying
yeah.
to tick off the worst and most infuriating uh, and disgusting crimes that you could possibly do. It's weird. You see it a lot in dictators as well. Saddam Hussein's a good example. Once he gets control of Iraq and properly gets it under his heel, that you just see this nosedive in moral conduct. It's as though he's trying to see how like low he can go, see how much he can get away with. Is there a point at which the universe itself would intervene and say, that's moral rock bottom, you can't do that? There does seem to be this like almost destructive curiosity in people with unchecked power, that they really want to just push the boat out, see how far they can go. I wonder if maybe that's part of what was going on with Epstein as well. The
There's
fact that he chose to do these crimes in such horrific ways, was it almost like a middle finger to the world, like just a way of exercising power, if nothing else?
there is that phrase. absolute evil corrupts absolutely. I've also heard the
Yeah.
argument that maybe that's not the
A-
case.
absolute power corrupts
Absolute power.
absolutely.
Sorry, yeah, yeah, but rather that power attracts the corrupted often. That no man or woman or anyone would want the burden of a dictator unless they have desires that only the power of a dictator could give them.
Yes.
That which
Yeah.
is
Or
scary.
yeah, for sure. Or those powers aren't, of course, always used for evil, um, but they can be, and that's a very attractive proposition for a lot of people, for sure. Yeah, there is. History is full of people that have coveted power and then finally got their hands on it and used it for all the wrong reasons. And it's another argument in political philosophy and in history about whether, like, a crown's a bad example because crowns are inherited, but like, is a crown something that corrupts the person who sits on it? Right, under it, you have to constantly be thinking about rivals. You're constantly paranoid about someone coming to try and take the throne off of you, and so you become a little bit overreaching and overly brutal. Or is it the case that these positions just happen to appeal to people who don't really have a moral compass anyway, and the ones who do have a moral compass aren't going to compete with them in the race to the throne? You just don't stand a chance.
And I'd argue that crowns are a system that not only creates that position of power that someone who would want could do horrible things with, but it also kind of helps create the people who would want to do those horrible things and puts them specifically in those positions because a lot of throughout history, a big common thing with royal families was incest. And we know how that affects, the mind of someone. So not only do you have years and years and years of incest creating these people are then mentored and taught by these people who were products of incest that were also raised in a society that says you need to go to war, you need to fight these people, you need to do this, which further creates this sense of this that just encourages that brutal mindset.
I'm not. I mean, if you're referring to the Habsburgs, who were probably the most famous family as a result of a political family that was successful as a result of inbreeding, I think it's partially true. I would actually argue myself that we often overestimate the power that medieval kings had. And that,
Really?
and the words like tyrant were still thrown around in the medieval era for a king who just trounced around on everyone and everything and wasn't willing to be beholden by the laws of the realm. And there were laws of the realm that, although didn't necessarily apply to the king personally, the king didn't have power over. All European kings, for instance, had to work really closely with the church. There was always a kind of conflict between the two of them, with the king seen as the kind of military authority. I'm massively simplifying here because we've got like 500 years of Europe to cover, but in general, the king being seen as a kind of a martial authority, the one who administers the laws and dishes out the punishments, and the church being seen as a kind of moral, intellectual authority. The thing that's still going to be here once the king's gone, the thing that interprets the nature of the universe and right and wrong and yada, yada, yada. And I actually think, for all the reputation of medieval Europe being a bit of a dark ages and a bit of a backwater, the dance between church and state, literally, I think it's an amazing accomplishment that they managed to hold each other to account for that long.
Sort of
Yeah,
checks and balances.
yeah,
That
exactly,
concept
exactly.
already in play. And though if you have a theocracy, that kind of falls apart because then the king becomes the church and all that. So theocracies are always very scary in that regard. Not crazy common in history from my knowledge, but
No, I was trying. So, at the moment, obviously, the US is at war with Iraq, which is an Islamic theocracy, a Shiite
yeah,
theocracy,
absolutely. I,
and
I can't believe I didn't think about that.
yeah, and I was thinking, our theocracies are like a kind of, because you often think of a theocracy as a kind of medieval thing, don't you? Right?
Sort of,
That
yeah.
it's not modern, that there's something almost backwards about it, this idea that the church and state are utterly entwined and indistinguishable. And so I was thinking there must have been some Christian theocracies in the past. Think, for instance, about the Crusades and that. There must have been some.
God king or king chosen
Yeah,
by God, at least in the faith.
yeah, yeah. And all kings were chosen by God in the medieval period. That was the belief. That's what um, the inauguration and the holy oil and yada 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 is
Yeah.
about. It's about
And
literally
unquestionable God came.
it's about transforming the man into more than a man, into something else. Not God, but God's chosen sort of instrument of power. But anyway,
Ceremony is
I
fascinating.
couldn't find one. I couldn't find any example of an actual Christian theocracy in medieval Europe, which I
Now,
thought was really interesting.
before medieval Europe, though, was there anything like? I mean, I know the Roman Empire was Christian for a long time. Was there any?
I can't think of one. Not one comes immediately to mind that wouldn't have a load of sort of but
Fascinating.
and so. I think the closest one you might be able to find, other than the Vatican, obviously,
Yeah.
would be perhaps some of the right-wing dictatorships in Central and South America during the Cold War, but they didn't tend to last very long.
Yeah. There are like a lot of cults tend to mirror governments in a sense. They tend to have their own power structure and all this internal politics, and they interact with the governments they exist within. So I guess you could argue that certain figures throughout modern history who've led cults could be seen as the closest equivalent to a theocracy, where maybe not by law because you exist in the United States or some other country, but by the laws that you've agreed to, and now that you've agreed to them, that there is some threat of violence if you try to leave. That might be the closest, I guess you could argue.
I suppose so. I mean, the abuses of power, I mean, you can find them everywhere all the time,
Absolutely.
past or present. Um, what I was commenting more that I found it interesting that there had not been. Oops, sorry,
Think
I've paused my
governments.
audio. That there had not been a Christian theocracy. But yeah, no, certainly cults. I mean, I think you could argue that the Nazi Germany was probably a cult as well, with its own religious and mythology.
They
Its
had a
own
lot
religious
of
and
weird
mythological
stuff.
beliefs that came along with the state as well.
They had a lot of very strange. I know Hitler was very. You have a whole series of videos of so and so was very weird. What be it Hitler, Churchill, um, very powerful people. Even modern day like Donald Trump. Say what you want to say about him. Very weird guy in general. Do you think there's
Yes, he's
something that
unusual.
very unusual? Yes. Do you think there's something about power that attracts the strange, or do you think power just makes you strange? Like, is it the pressure, or is there some other factor we're missing here?
No, such and such was a weird guy. When I first started doing World War II stuff, couldn't possibly make a video on any subjects of World War II without encountering Holocaust deniers or people who are actively like speaking positively about Hitler or the Third Reich.
Very
So I set
strange.
out to make a couple of videos saying, no, the Nazis were not left wing, they were right wing. Hitler was a weird guy, not a cool guy. The Holocaust did really happen. Here's the proof. But the Hitler was a weird guy format did really well. And so I was like, okay, who else was a weird guy? I've done a couple of them now, and I must say, I don't think anyone is not weird. So
Fair
it could be
points.
anyone. I think any historical character who exists in the public imagination. Like if I was to say, Qin Shi Huang was a weird guy, you would be like, who cares, right? I don't know who he is.
Very,
But if
yeah.
I was to
I
say
can't lie. I don't.
Churchill was a weird guy, you'd be like, oh, I know who he is. Everyone knows the pictures. He's the guy from England. He led England, Britain in the Second World War. You immediately have a character association with him, and then you're like, okay, what's weird about him? I want to go. But basically, anyone, I think, honestly, anyone in the public imagination, past or present, you could make that video about because we all have foibles, and I think
Absolutely.
that's the point. The point of those videos, especially, like obviously, Stalin and Hitler aren't that controversial. Most people think that they're evil. Churchill's fairly controversial because on one side he's a national hero. He did saving Britain, or at least played a major part in saving Britain from fascism and later Europe from it as well. But he also has his own track record of some pretty dodgy statements and some pretty dodgy actions too. Um, but I think the point of the videos is, and I think the point of history in more generally is, history is done by humans, and humans are complicated and unpredictable and weird, and they are not cartoon characters. Even Hitler, who is probably, I think, in the public imagination, the worst person to have ever lived. I don't think that's necessarily an exaggeration either. He's responsible personally
Very
for some
arguable.
awful things,
Yeah.
and he's a nasty. Even in his personal life, Hitler has very few redeeming qualities.
He was good to animals, I think.
He was good to animals,
That's about
yes,
all I
I
can think of.
suppose,
Yeah.
yeah, but like Stalin, for instance, uh, arguably just as vicious as Hitler, at least in terms of his politics and in terms of his uh, wielding of absolute power, his view on how life worked, on how trivial and throwaway it was. Um, but Stalin was incredibly intelligent in a way that Hitler just wasn't. Stalin spoke. Stalin would be given um, gifts of, like, because Stalin was raised as an Orthodox Christian, so he'd be given gifts of Bibles in Greek and Greek literature around the Bible from friends and that, because it was banned obviously in the Soviet Union at the time. And he would correct the Greek that had been translated.
That's insane.
Yeah, like whatever you might think of Stalin as a terrible person, and he was, he has so many clear and redeeming qualities that make you like you can't help but feel this sense of attraction to him. Not in the sense of wanting to follow him or to admire him, but just that this was someone who was almost bigger than life.
Absolutely.
Hitler, I don't feel that way about. I
I only
actually
think
think he's a bit of a moron. And I
definitely
think the
seems like
people
a
around him
moron.
thought that he was a moron.
I saw it described as Hitler and the Nazis were actually seen as kind of lunatics, like goofy before they took power. That they were seen as not necessarily backwoods, but wild, extremist, goofy people you'd see on the streets shouting stuff that no one would ever listen to. And then one
Yes.
day they signed that they kind of just managed to pull it together and take over the country, and the rest is very horrible history.
Yeah. Yeah. But they were. I agree with you. They were goofy. And Hitler remained for his whole life quite a goofy person. Um, he's not someone you can really take seriously. Uh, so
They were almost like
that's the point of the video is someone who is seen as the worst possible person on earth, who did some of the worst things for sure, remains human,
yeah.
complicated, full of contradictions.
The
Anyone can do
Nazis,
it.
if I had to compare, like they were almost a bunch of LARPers at some point, weren't they? They were very much obsessed with this image of a past that wasn't really ever a thing. They were really focused on aesthetic. The whole, there's a reason that Nazis are so popular in media because A, they're great punching bags. B, they dressed very distinctly. They were very good at this image.
Yeah, the Nazi branding is still state of the art. I mean, we're somewhat inoculated against it now because we collectively have got past the horrors of the 20th century. And please, please, let's hope we've continued to remember and learn the lessons. But can you imagine having never seen propaganda, branding, messaging, imaging that clean, that
That's true.
eye-catching for the first time in 1933? I mean, it's not surprising at all that these people were totally entranced by it. And I think personally, social media, some of the ways that accounts work on social media takes advantage of that exact same impulse. We have a new form of media now that's ultra quick, where messages are gotten within 10 or 15 seconds, let alone a minute or two. And you can misuse that power so effectively. And we, as people, are not really ready to deal with that kind of intellectual, not intellectual, of propagandizing force, you know?
Absolutely. And we had a game developer on last, and his game was very political. And one thing he did really point out was fascism was bad at a lot of things. They had their branding on point, and they still kind of do. That's the
I
one thing
agree, they still
oh,
do.
they are good at that, make you feel something and directing that feeling towards a certain group. They're really good at finding that scapegoat to say, oh, these are the people who we need to get rid of. They're the ones destroying society. And it's really scary because I've seen people I know fall for it.
Yes, well, I think, as you say, it sort of activates those really dark instinctual impulses of trying to find an out group to blame, that there is some thing that lives amongst you that's responsible for your feeling of having lost control, of having less opportunities, of being less safe, and that all you need to do is remove the thing and we'll all be fine. That's definitely part of the appeal, but I think the other thing as well is, and this is, have you heard the argument that the left can't meme?
I have.
Right, so
I
just
yeah,
to clear my throat, I'm not really on the left, so I'm not out to defend them, but
I
I think
understand.
I know why they can't meme, and I think it's because generally leftist discourse is convoluted and broad and slow and a bit exhausting. It's very hard to boil it down into like 10 words. Here we go. And also, it's not necessarily tribalist. So lefts might say something like, "Oh, it's the rich versus the poor." That's the closest they can get to tribalism, but that's not really had any power since the 20th
Yeah,
century. And most people find that kind of argument a bit cringe, even though arguably in today's world it might be, because wealth inequality is insane at the moment.
I think it's the worst,
Um,
as bad as it's been since the Gilded Age. I've seen.
right?
I'm
Yeah,
not sure how true that statistic is, but it's rough.
I've seen a fair bit. Again, it's not modern politics isn't my thing, but I've seen a fair bit from people who aren't necessarily involved in a certain political movement who have acknowledged that this is becoming a bit of an issue. In any case, the right, on the other hand, I think what makes their memes so funny is that they're able to oversimplify a bit, cut through the discussion, and present you with something that looks like a fact and makes you think, "Oh my God, there's the answer." Um, if you took crime statistics, for instance, right? So uh, it would be very easy to make an argument on the basis of race or how races behave to look at crime statistics and be like, oh, there's your problem. This group of people commit more crime per capita than the other. They're the issue.
Ignoring a lot of
Whereas I think,
context. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's how the
the
right works
correct
with it. Yeah,
impulse is to say, okay, why? Why is that
absolutely.
happening? Why does that group commit more crime? But it's not as funny. If you just meme it as, if you just make a reel or a post about how this is the problem, this is the group, this is the crime, bam, it's done. Deal with them when the problem's over. It's so easy to be like, oh, that's the problem. Yeah, and it could be funny at the same time because it's so short and to the point. And
Absolutely. I know.
you're not going to get any laughs or pats on the back if you put your finger up and go, excuse me, actually, would you mind if we had a look at the reasons why these groups tend to commit more crime, let's say?
A lot less funny. Yeah. Though, one thing I will say about the far left that they do better than the far right, in my experience at least, is or long form content. Because I can think of several very impactful, very meaningful stories by very, very, like, even more left leaning people than I am. Like, I have one right behind me right here. That fell on the floor. That also fell on the floor. But I have this, The Scar by China Mieville, who is once again another fantasy writer, but does a fantastic job of exploring, actual depth in his works. And he's very communist. He's very, and that comes across in his works. He's very communist. He's very left leaning, very anti-authoritarian, and that is very strong. And I can think of several very left leaning works like that, but the only one I've read from a right leaning perspective that actually landed in recent years would be the Sun Eater saga, which actually does a very good job of exploring right leaning politics, very conservative ideals in a long form story, but less often in my experience.
I would probably say so. I can't think, to be honest, again, I try not, I do have very strong political opinions, but I'm not affiliated with either side of the debate. I'm more concerned about international politics than I am domestic politics.
Especially in today's world where it's getting so crazy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think as someone who studies a lot of history, I'm not a historian. As someone who studies a lot of history, I think it's important to have a voice that's just like, here's what the facts are, here's
Yeah,
what the past tells us, here's the patterns repeating. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm correct. I'm not saying I want to come out and lecture, but these are opinions that I hold quite strongly, and I think that I have a responsibility to share them. As for left versus right politics, again, if you look at on long form politics, if you look at So there's a British influencer called Paul Joseph Watson, who's a
I've not
right
heard of him.
wing.
I'll
Right,
look him up.
he's a right wing commentator, and he makes sort of 20, 25 minute videos at a time. But even then, they're segmented into small issues, 2 minutes at a time. So even in those circumstances, although it's long form content, it's segmented. It's really fast paced. Issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, issue 4. Um, so you've covered all the things in 20 minutes that you need to cover to have the whole worldview, but none of it is particularly deep. And again, we're talking about Nazi branding, about the world of the media, and how, you know, the early incarnations of the radio and mass media really helped the Nazi movement. I'm not saying Paul Joseph Watson is a Nazi. I don't know enough about him to say, but I think that our media environment now, the fact that everything is reduced to really short sound bites, naturally helps right wingers to get their message out, because it's much punchier.
Now, do you think we could see left-wing fascism? Is that a possibility? Does that happen? Or is that inherently contradictory?
Yeah.
I think you
So
could. Well,
what is fascism, I suppose, would be
that's
the
yeah.
question.
I suppose it's the violent suppression of other opinions. The violent saying, "Oh, if you a one-party system that would not allow the existence of other parties
Well,
violently."
then we've already had it, because that was what the
That's
Soviet
true.
Union
Yeah,
was.
that's true. Yeah, you have a very good point. They were left-leaning economically wise, weren't they? They were very communist. Also, in the West, I've actually encountered very often where I'll be in a debate with someone, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm very left-leaning," and they're like, why are you talking about communism? Why are you talking about, worker or the rights of these groups and all this? Isn't left-leaning economic based? And that's interesting for me to have noticed that there is different interpretations of what left-leaning can be across the world.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the 90s and noughties, left leaning just meant anti establishment. In the
Very true.
60s and 70s, before the Soviet Union fell, left leaning literally meant communist and socialist, because people believed that what was happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain wasn't anywhere near as bad as it turned out to be. Nowadays, left leaning means blue haired, soy milk drinking, sort of dribbling and confused about one's gender or sexuality, when I think very few people who consider themselves on the left actually identify with that image of themselves at all. I
I
don't
would have blue
actually think
hair, but I'm kind of
for
I'm kind of
I
limited in my
don't
options.
I don't think that there is actually a left anymore. I think that there is
Dang.
probably a moderate center that's sort of based on the neoliberal post Second World Order rules and trade, yada yada. Obviously, there are a few satellite parties around them that want more market control and so on and so on. So you've got those, and then I think you've got what I would call not even right wingers anymore, but traditionalists.
Yeah, it's liberals versus traditionalists at this point, not left versus right. So you're getting at?
Definitely. And if we're going to
Yeah,
have that argument, I'll come out right away and say that I'm 100% a liberal.
I am as
Um,
well.
li- yeah, liberalism has actually lost its meaning a little bit. So a liberal is someone, like, if we're talking actual terminology, not not how it's used today, but what the word actually started to mean. What the word meant when it was started. A liberal is someone who believes in a relatively small state, who thinks that individual rights should be protected, and that the state exists basically to protect those rights. And you could make the argument very easily as a liberal that one of the rights that you should have is the right to healthcare, and you should have a state large enough to protect that right. So you could be a liberal and still have a fairly large state, as it just depends on what your umbrella of rights are. And in foreign policy, you have realists and liberals. Realists think the world is about power. It's about balancing these different world powers so that no one can start a war, and then you have peace. Peace is a moving target. Liberals think that the point of foreign policy is to spread democracy. So the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that was a liberal foreign policy. It was about getting democracy into the Middle East. Because if we're all democracies, we won't have any need to argue and there won't be any more wars.
Absolutely.
Right? So if you describe liberalism to the average person, what it actually
Um,
means, it sounds quite conservative, doesn't it?
it does a little bit. Yeah, it's small state, trying to spread influence across the world. Now,
Yeah.
I guess you can also argue that you don't have to spread democracy violently. It could be through. Now, that's going to get very much in the weeds, though.
It's not, it's not about spreading democracy per se. what it is liberals and realists both think that the world is fundamentally without a governing body. There's no world police. There's no one authority to appeal to. So it's a state of chaos. And so how best in a state of chaos to avoid war? Realists think you just need both sides to be perfectly matched, or as close to perfectly matched as you can, so no one can overcome the other and there's no appetite for war. Liberals think if we all agree the same thing, we won't have anything to fight about.
A basic understanding of an idea that everyone.
Personally,
Go ahead,
sorry, please continue. No, go on.
I was going to say, I think there should be like this idea of basic human rights across the world. That in a perfect world, there would be freedom of religion, freedom of speech, all these freedoms in every country, and there wouldn't be dictators oppressing that. But we don't live in a perfect world. Far from it.
No, we don't. But that's the dilemma, isn't it? Is how to deal with these states. A realist would say, so long as there's a balance of power, there's no real problem of a mass conflagration, and we can avoid the horrors of the Second World War again. Liberals would come along and say that the Second World War fundamentally came out of an ideological disagreement between ultra right-wing fascism in Germany and the liberal world order to its left, to its borders east and west. Again, it's a source of constant disagreement. But as we said earlier, I do think that there's been a split in our world now, politically, and it's gone from left to right to liberal and traditionalist. And I don't even know if I like the word traditionalism, because I'm not sure what the tradition exactly is that they're harping back to. But I personally think that we are going to be so much poorer, so much in a world that's so much more violent, and so much less happy in a world where we forget our liberal values. They have done us so well since 1945. They are amazing, and that's what the Second World War was all about. And what a waste to throw it away.
Your point with you don't even know what they're harping back to. There is this kind of idea I've seen, and I think I've seen this on both ends of the spectrum, but this better time, when the world wasn't as it is now. We need to go back to whether it be we're men, this argument of, men back in the day were all manly and buff, and they all had all this hair on their chest, and they hated bright colors, and they all beat their wife. But if you go back far enough, you'll find that the idea of a manly, noble man was very pompously dressed, that high heels were used to get on horses for archery, that, there was this, that almost every idea of traditionalism that we say is how it's always been, you can go far enough back and strip away and say, no, we didn't do that.
Yes. Yeah. Even, I mean, I think this is where a lot of the argument comes from, isn't it? You could even make the argument there that would naturally follow from what you've said, which is that basically gender roles are arbitrary. They're a product of current times. They're likely to change in the future, and they have changed before in the past. And I think that statement alone makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from, is a sense of uncertainty, the sense of like, where's north and south if it's all constantly in flux and changing? Let's just have a clear answer. When there isn't one. And even if you think of the sort of classic apple pie nuclear family, real America, that lasted for about 20 years between 1945 and 1965. By the 70s, it was gone. And before then, it was the Great Depression. Both genders work in the fields and all sorts of, this sort of memory of a perfect time, even if it did exist, it was such a short window that it's by no means the natural order of things or the way things should and must be.
Yeah. And you see these organizations that love that. I think, for example, as a fantasy writer, I think fantasy kind of helps this aesthetic a little bit, in a bad way. It's really easy to call back to, look how cool the Romans were, look how cool the Spartans were, look how manly that, and then, you have groups like I know there's like the New Knights or whatever in America. There's groups that harper back to that aesthetic so powerfully. And it's blinding in a way. You can really easily get lost in that.
Yeah, it's super powerful. And again, we were talking about Nazi branding. That's what they were up to.
Amazing at that, yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, if you look at a lot of the right-wing, or what you might call the right-wing side of the argument now, a lot of their arguments are based in the past tense, right? Make America Great Again.
Again.
Yeah, or in the UK we have Restore Britain. This idea that there's something that's been lost that we need to bring back, and then it'll all be okay. But if you poll people, I mean, I don't know about American politics, but in the UK people, if you poll people that are like moving more to the right now and are thinking of voting for what used to be called extremist right parties, but are now almost mainstream, and ask them what they feel like they've lost, they'll tell you it's things like the butchers or old-fashioned grocers. So not supermarkets, not like big shopping malls, but just independently run little businesses where there was a sense of community, yada yada yada. You know, surely these people are not actually that angry because they've lost the butchers. It's just this sense of nostalgia, the sense of having lost something so powerful. And I think it's partially true. I think we have lost something. I think our generation and the generation, I'm 30, so people between, say, 40 and 20, I think we have lost something
The
that
world
our
is
parents
drastically
got.
different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and not just in terms of like the butcher's shops and the nice signs outside the grocers, but we've lost the opportunity, for instance, to buy a house, to be middle class. The same social contract no longer applies, and it makes a lot of people feel angry and powerless. And I don't wholly blame them for wanting a change of circumstance. I just don't think
Absolutely.
that what's popular now is the answer.
Yeah, I do think what people really do miss though, a lot of things is a sense of tight knit community. You mentioned the whole butcher shop and all that. I think there's something to be said about going to like a marketplace instead of a Walmart. And you get to go to these butchers you trust, and there's this individuality that everyone has instead of just going to this. I often, as someone who enjoys cooking, I often fantasize about the reality of living close to a local market area where I can go pick out these things and go home and make dinner. And there's something special about that. But
Yeah,
I
for
don't
sure, for
think the
sure.
reason we I don't think the reason we've lost it is because people want to dye their hair blue. In fact, if you look at the not necessarily the extreme, but if you look at a lot of left-leaning parts of society, those are the people who try their best to get back to that, who try their best to go buy this handmade product from this local artistic store. And I'm saying that aren't conservatives who do that. I think a big thing is the fact that liberals are just there's a better network amongst them at doing that.
I, I, I don't think again, I think that's why liberals get this reputation for being sort of snobby hippies who buy sourdough bread from the man down the road, because they think they're better than everyone else. That's the argument that a lot of conservatives feel. But I think you're right. I think a lot of it does come from a sense of wanting to buy something that someone has made, and to be able to contribute to their making it, so that they're there again tomorrow, so that there's a physical place run by real people that you can
Absolutely, yeah.
see, where you can go and get things and interact with other people who are around you. I don't, I, you know, I'm all for it. I lived abroad for 4 years and moved back in December. Now, while I was abroad, I was building my business that I've since finished, and then building my YouTube channel. So I basically didn't have any money, really. So it suited me to live abroad where life was cheap, and or where I could basically just like skimp by to get this going. But now I'm back on my feet and there's money in my pocket. I basically instantly moved back to the UK because I wanted to be here. I thought, if young people like me are going to just leave as soon as the money starts hitting their bank account, this country's going to be fucked in a couple of years.
House
Like,
place dies.
yeah, exactly. So I need to be back here, and I am back here, and I do my best wherever I can to always support small businesses. And you know, I know it's not much, but that's my way of of trying to be an ethical consumer. And I
And I
don't, by
think
the way, if there are any Brits watching this, I don't think it's a bad thing to leave to get your shit sorted out. But once the money starts coming in, uh, you know, uh, you should be conscientious about where you're living and who you're helping, and paying your
I think
taxes to as well.
also those goods, those local goods. This is a small thing, but I have a local coffee shop I love to go to. It's my favorite place. Their coffee is significantly better than any chain store. I was at a Starbucks recently because it was the only option I had, and it was horrid. I don't know how people drink this. Which it's these local producers are going to have much higher quality stuff. At
Definitely,
least
but
on
again, I
average.
think a lot of the anger comes from the fact that people my age who aren't running a YouTube channel, for instance, but are perhaps still teaching, are not going to be able to afford, at least in the UK, if they want to save for a house, to visit that nice coffee shop very often.
That's true. Yeah.
They miss out on it because it's too expensive.
Yeah.
And really, when you go to these independent, I mean, I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, when you go to these independent coffee shops, you're kind of voting with your dollars. You're paying
Yeah.
slightly more, but either because you want a really nice thing or because you want to support a world in which small businesses can survive.
I
But
think.
you know,
Yeah.
if you're really tight on cash and you just need coffee,
Yeah.
it's
It's
hard to have those conversations with
Dunkin'
yourself.
is a lot cheaper and oftentimes faster, and it's very familiar too for a lot of people. That's something we like about fast food is you go to McDonald's anywhere in the world, you're getting McDonald's. You're not getting local variation of it.
Yeah, I can go to Bangkok. I can go to McDonald's in Bangkok and have the same menu items that I
We
have
could
here in
go
the
eat the
UK, and
exact
they
same.
taste the same.
We could go eat the exact same thing right now if we wanted to. That's kind of weird. We've gotten off topic, haven't we? Have gone everywhere. We started on a history, now we're talking about local shopping, which I guess it's. I was watching your live stream, and one thing someone said to you is don't talk about politics, talk about history. And your
Yes,
response was basically, how? How do I only talk about history when all history really is politics that have already happened?
yes. Well,
So
yeah, I'd say so.
it
Well,
all ties together.
I wouldn't say
Sorry,
that's all it is, but you definitely could not. How you see the world is 100% going to flavor how you see history. And how you see history is going to 100% flavor how you see the modern world. To argue that they're inseparable is to basically miss the point of how humans work and interpret the world around them. And actually, if we're going to get to like you shouldn't do it, you're not qualified. I'm actually more qualified to talk about politics than I am history because I've done a degree in it, and I didn't do a degree in history. Um, yeah, no, I hate that argument.
yeah.
In general, I actually I hate the argument that that politics is not something that should be mixed with art.
I
Um,
fully agree with that.
and
I,
I see myself more as an artist and a creative than I do a historian. I'm not a historian. What I do is I go and research videos. I try and find a nice way to tell the story whilst remaining true to the facts. And I try and put this together into a video that makes you feel something or kills 20 minutes for you. That's
absolutely.
art. That's not history, you know? And
And
art's political.
yeah, coming from a fellow artist, I think the argument that art should be non-political comes from a very entitled view, because politics. If you're not the top 1%, politics are the real world. But I see a lot of people treat politics as if it's like a sports game. Like, don't bring up the sports game or the football game at the dinner table. You're just gonna get pissed at each other, and it doesn't actually matter. But politics isn't just which team wins. Politics directly affects your life, especially for certain groups. Like if being this religion gets banned in a country, that will destroy lives in that country. So demanding that their art not at all reflect that anxiety, that fear, is it's coming from a position of insane entitlement because that means you do not have to worry about politics. You're in a position where it cannot affect you. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's very strange to me.
George Orwell famously said that the belief that politics shouldn't have a place in art is itself a political
It
belief.
is.
You're not
Absolutely,
getting away
yeah.
from it.
You can't even
I,
go ahead.
I would say though that despite my reputation online, because usually obviously everything that I get asked to talk about or that I do talk about could very easily pull into politics. I'm not someone who will talk to everyone all the time about politics. You know, I do think that there's a time and a place for these
I have to
conversations, and
Yeah.
I actually find it quite exhausting when I'm around people that can only
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about politics.
I think there's a place and time, and I also think you have to pick your battle. Because, like I said, like where I live, I'm definitely in the minority of my belief system. So if I want to go to the store, I can't just be like shouting at them how they're wrong and evil for believing the way they believe. I would never get anything done in my life. And I have more going on than the direct politics side of things as well. So it'd get exhausting.
It would get exhausting. I often interact with people who I know I'm not going to see eye to eye with on things, and I do often dance around the topic. Or if they want to start, I'm happy to engage.
You're
But
prepared for it.
yeah, but I tend to take a more Socratic view. So like on here, I think people are relatively interested in what I have to say. They wouldn't be tuned in otherwise. So I'm quite happy to just come out with what I think. Because this isn't a debate. We're not trying to win. You're just asking me what I think, and I'm telling you.
You're trying to find the gap.
But if someone was to sort of, who I really disagreed with, was to bring up the subject of politics, and I had the energy to have a conversation, I think that I would be much more inclined to use a Socratic method, where you basically just ask them opinions about their worldview and try and see if you can catch a contradiction.
Yeah,
And
that makes
if you
sense.
can, then you've invited a thought, and sometimes that's enough. You know, I'm not trying to be a missionary for anything, but I just think that sometimes you need to kind of be in the ring for the truth a little bit.
I think also with debates, it's not necessarily about winning. It's about finding who's right. And that person who's right isn't necessarily like, haha, I'm better than you. It's an opportunity to go, oh, wow, I found new information that I can go live my life with. It's a good thing to lose a debate sometimes, because if you don't, you're never gaining any information. You want to adjust your worldview from time to time.
Yes, that's true. I think if you're having a debate with someone who comes in with the same mindset that you do, but uh, like I'm quite a competitive person naturally,
I
and
am,
I
but
love a debate. I love a debate, but I'm very conscious not to get into debates, especially on YouTube, because I know that if there were an audience watching, I would feel the need to try and leave my opponent in the dust. And
yeah,
that's not good for anyone.
yeah.
Even if I do get what I want and win the debate, who has actually
They're just
learned anything?
angry that they're just angry and they feel like they couldn't have put their point across well. That's all they feel.
Yeah. And
That's
their
that's
audience will think I'm a dick, and my
yeah,
audience will think, oh, hey, you got him. But reality, has the world changed? Has
not at
anyone
all.
really reconsidered their beliefs? Have I reconsidered mine?
Now,
Probably not.
on a grand stage, like if you're like on like like it looks like a presidential debate, there's definitely advantages to making your opponent look like an idiot if you're trying to win. There's definitely, oh, I want to be president or prime minister, what have you. If I can make all my competition look like idiots, I am much more likely to get the votes, even from their supposed supporters, depending on how loyal they are to that person.
Yeah, it's definitely true that as a politician, you want to try and um, make yourself look smarter than your opponent, and sometimes that means pulling your opponent up if they've said something wrong. But if you look at the standard of presidential debates now compared to say in the 70s or 80s, there's an absolute nosedive in accepted conduct. Um,
Sure, yeah.
these people were still fighting for the highest office in the country, and yet were able to be civil and polite to
Uh,
one another. And
you're,
nowadays, right, just in case, these people in
yeah.
the 70s were competing for the highest office in the country, and they were happy to wade into debate with one another. But one thing they were not happy to do was disgrace themselves by just tearing chunks out the other person, using the lowest possible forms of insults, and trying to score these ridiculous kind of not
Gotcha
even
moments.
intellectual gotchas, but not intellectual gotchas, not ha, I proved that you were wrong on that comment. Just you're a scumbag or you're a moron or you know and the fact that the public has accepted that this is the new standard of discourse, that you can actually win an election off the basis of this really toxic way of speaking to more people, I think it's a massive shame.
It's
um
deeply worrying for our society.
I think it's
Oh,
a
you're good.
crying shame.
Yeah, it is deeply worrying. So, I suppose I've watched let you off here. I've kept you for quite a while now and had a really interesting conversation. I would love at some point to have you on again, especially if we could have our other host on, because he's usually with me and he's a bit more right leaning than I am. So I think it'd be good to have a bit more counterbalance, because I'm very left leaning, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, I could tell.
Yeah, if I had hair, it would be blue, and it's for sure I might dye the beard blue. But yeah, it was great having you on, and thank you again for taking this time. And
My pleasure,
flashback
thanks for
history,
having me.
everyone. All right, you have
Yeah.
a nice night, sir.